Is there life after death? After the lid is closed, the mourners have dispersed, and those left behind have stepped back into their daily routines. For them, for us, the cycle of life continues, at least for the moment. And we're all left wondering, what waits beyond that final shallow breath? As the light flickers out and blackness washes over us, a blanket of nothingness for all time? Or are there more chapters to come? Is this really the end? Or merely a prelude to things yet to be experienced? One door closes, another one opens. Are the very places we're left to sleep that dreamless sleep of eternity simply stopovers on our way into the light? Stone and marble monuments to the dead cast their shadows, and all but beckon us to stay. Is death really the end? This age-old question has plagued mankind since the beginning of time itself. But for some, this question has already been answered. Gary and Nancy Lombardi met during the heyday of the disco era. She was a feisty dental assistant with a twinkle in her eye and a list of ex-boyfriends as long as an eviction notice in a trailer park. Nancy, or the Carnival Ride, as she was known by her party friends, was a wild child with a taste for the unusual, but with a heart of gold. A small-town girl with big city dreams. Enter Gary Lombardi, tall, lanky, good-looking, and fresh out of prison. He'd taken a vow of celibacy his first day in lockdown, partly to make amends for his past reckless behavior. And he'd also naively thought he'd have a choice when his cellmate, Clarence the Fist Marconi, tapped him on the shoulder at 3 a.m. and whispered that terrible phrase he never thought he'd hear, "Brace yourself." The day Gary was released from prison, he beat up 3 proctologists and a rubber glove salesman from Omaha. Gary's displaced anger played a major role in his joining his first and only psychological encounter group, Men Who Are Afraid to Sleep on Their Stomach. Nancy seemed to be the only person who could calm Gary during one of those rages. Friends and family were amazed at how Gary changed whenever he was around her. His anger seemed to literally melt into her embrace, and whenever he would feel his demons rise up in his head, he'd cry out for Nancy to hold him. The shaking would subside, and the negative thoughts would fade away. No more throwing chunks of concrete off interstate overpasses. No more impromptu visits to local pet shops just so he could hold puppies underwater when staff members weren't looking. No more replacing diabetic drug addicts' powder cocaine with pure cane sugar just to see what would happen next time they snorted. No more forcing elderly rest home patients, where he worked part-time, to participate in cruel, humiliating Halloween games like bobbing for diapers or strip checkers. Gary had finally found his soulmate, and she found hers. As time passed, their love grew even stronger. 2 became 3, and 3 became 4, as 2 sons, first Garrett, then Matthew, came into their lives, completing what appeared to be a storybook family. Not that Garrett and Matthew were perfect, like the time they drugged their babysitter and buried her under 1.5 yards of field dirt, all because she wouldn't allow them to stay up for WrestleMania 6. But more often than not, Garrett and Matthew were a joy and a sense of pride for both Gary and Nancy. But unlike fairy tales, this story doesn't have a happy ending. On a rainy Thursday night, 2004, Gary was returning from his real estate office after a late-night closing. His client had insisted upon toasting the deal with iced tea glasses filled with Tennessee sipping liquor. Except they hadn't sipped it. Gary was sky-high and nearly naked behind the wheel. It'd been some time since he had drank so much in so little time. He must have thought he was running later than he was, because it was later estimated he was traveling at nearly 100 miles an hour when he hit the Angus bull, which had torn its way through a weak spot in the fence. When the ambulance arrived, sadly, it was already too late. Ironically, the bull survived, losing only a testicle and most of his hearing in the crash. Gary, though, wasn't so lucky. Nancy was understandably devastated. She tried to make a go of it alone in their house, but the memories of them together filled her head. Every time she turned around, she'd see an object, a piece of furniture, the bathroom door left open, Gary's clothes lying on the floor in a filthy heap, left there where he peeled them off after a hard day at work. Little reminders of Gary were everywhere. The cigarette burns on the arm of Gary's favorite chair, left behind after a drunken argument one New Year's Eve. The words Happy New Year crudely burned into the material, still legible. Nancy had to chuckle as she remembered he'd spell year with 2 E's. Nancy found herself spending more and more time at Gary's office, sitting alone in the dark. She'd promised herself she would clean out the office alone. The memories there were alive and well. There was a lot to do. She'd gather up items and drive them to a storage building she'd rented soon after the accident. Gary's extensive butterfly collection, his favorite shuffleboard Puck, his autographed picture of Marilyn Manson printed in his own blood, handfuls of soil and grass from the ground walked on by Chip Vanderbilt, a man he'd met in Memphis who claimed to be Elvis's official dry cleaner for most of the 1950s. The soil was carefully stored in a large mason jar. Nancy had to stop and smile as she remembered Gary paying over $300 to have the jar hermetically sealed. One evening, Nancy was boxing up Gary's celebrity toothbrush collection when a loud thump suddenly shattered the silence. At first, she thought she was hearing things, but just a moment later, another thump. This time louder and more pronounced, reverberating down the hallway near the bathroom. Then, strangely, the air seemed to permeate with a smell of cheap cigarettes and stale coffee. Convinced it was a sign from Gary, Nancy cried out his name. No response. Just silence. She waited and cried out again, "Gary!" Nothing. Nancy could feel her skin tingle and the goosebumps rise on her neck. Then what seemed to be coming from a distant place came the rhythmic, measured sound of heavy breathing. She dropped whatever she was doing and scurried out the office front door, barely stopping long enough to lock it. 3 days later, she called our network and asked for an investigation. Short Stories was happy to take a look, and for the next week or so, our investigators carefully examined every inch of the office space in that small building. Preliminary testing indicated a presence may indeed be inside. We set up our surveillance equipment in several locations throughout the tiny office. We chose areas where our investigators had experienced cold spots, or small places near the floor where the inside temperatures dipped dramatically, signs of paranormal activity. What you are about to see may startle you. This footage represents excerpts from a total surveillance period of about 3 days. The audio quality is substandard, but the images are undeniable. For some, this short film will offer hope. For other more skeptical observers, simply another ruse waiting to be exposed. For myself, the story of Gary and Nancy Lombardi provides further undeniable evidence that death, as we know it, is just a rest stop on the eternal interstate highway. For Short Stories from Beyond, I'm Lars Bigelow. Good night.